The word privilege is an example of a loaded term that means one thing in the colloquial sense and another in the academic sense, and one half is discussing the academic terminology, and the other half doesn't understand their terminology and gets super offended because they're using the colloquial definition. When people think privilege, they think of the privileged class or the wealthy, even though one of the dictionary definitions is a right or immunity granted as particular benefit, advantage, or favor. They get really angry when you tell them that they are privileged, even though they are so much lower on the social and income ladder than someone they view as privileged. They view privilege as a level in society, and that is where we come to verbal blows on the issue. In a role-playing game, as you progress and gain sufficient points or experience, you level up. This makes you stronger and more powerful, much more able to take down problems the beginner would get slaughtered by. This is what they think of when you say privilege without explaining your terms. You're telling them that everything is easy for them and they never had to struggle or work hard at all. Instead, in gaming terms, don't think of privilege as a character level, but think of it as a character buff that gives a boost only in certain situations that compounds over time. Sometimes you're unlucky and takes you forever to level up, even with the buffs, but you still have them, and if you could look back and see how much worse it could have been without those buffs, you could clearly see it. But thanks to natural biases, it takes a lot of introspection and awareness of others' experiences and data to understand this, and it's easy to deny that you even have these buffs. I used to happily believe that my hard work is what made me successful, and my obeying the law is why I never got in trouble with the cops. The universe worked for me, and if it was unfair, it was unfair to all. Until the advent of the internet, it was very easy to believe this, until the borders of our geographic bubbles burst and we were all subjected to other people's experiences and relatively easy access to scientific data. Suddenly I began to realize that non-white, non-straight, non-male people had way more disadvantages than me. They had curses or debuffs I did not have, but since I can't see stats of other players like you can in a game, and I could never experience what they have, and never saw or knew the average cross-sectional data, and I believed happily that everyone lived in a fair, just system, and if you believe this, then if there is inequality, obviously they must not be working hard and constantly breaking the law. It's why I thought women had a privilege in the workplace, and false rape charges were higher than they actually are, and rape and sexual harassment in general was way lower than it actually is. I thought the cycle of crime and poverty problems were problems blacks were much more to blame for than they actually were. I thought cops only pulled people over for doing crime, not due to skin color, which data shows cops routinely pull black people over, and they get harassed way more than white people do. Any lip or wrong move could end up with being shot by law if a cop believes themselves to be in danger. He can get off scot-free for shooting or killing anyone, as it's incredibly hard to prove belief. Way more racists are on the police force and actively recruit fellow white supremacists to the police force, as there is little oversight for that, and the FBI has been warning us for decades about this. I believed everyone got equal representation in court by well-paid public defenders, as it's in the Constitution, but some states overwork and underpay their public defenders so much that they only get 10 minutes with a client and just have to tell them to take a plea deal, and that looks good on the cop's record of a high conviction to arrest rate. Redlining prevented blacks for most of the 20th century from living in the same areas as whites and getting the same mortgage rates as whites, even though they were equally likely to default on the mortgage. Due to this kind of past history, algorithms using this old data have in fact continued to charge higher interest rates for blacks or refuse them a mortgage to the point that within this decade, a black female CEO had to get her Asian husband with a much lower paying job to co-sign for their mortgage. Benevolent neglect was a concept that Nixon coined to just abandon the inner city when new jobs were created in small towns through new technology, and all of these jobs vanished, making the hard-earned housing black folks had struggled and paid for suddenly become worthless, and the police stopped being paid thanks to no more taxes, turning these areas into gang war zones where hopeless nihilism reigned. Rural folks are now learning how this can happen the hard way, where the neglect of the rural infrastructure has caused the rural jobs to shift back to the cities, leaving them now with worthless homes, and moving to another town for work is a complete gamble, so they shift to meth and opioids and other crimes to feed their habits, completely oblivious that this is exactly what happened to urban blacks they used to look down on so much. From this, many blacks have PTSD from violence and crime they had to deal with. Poor neighborhoods have high levels of toxic dumping and pollution and lead and mercury levels, as middle-class people can raise a stink and have the resources to get the EPA to investigate their area and enforce laws, while poor people do not. Food deserts and poor public transit plagues many poor areas of the city, as well as poor access to good schools and gentrification. And of course, unconscious bias, where a black-sounding name or a woman's name is much less likely to get a call back for a job than a white male-sounding name with the exact same resume and credentials. And even black cops in psychological tests view black kids as older than white kids, and black cops view black men as bigger and stronger than they actually are. And white shoplifters love having a black person in the store because they know the shopkeeper will be watching the black person and not paying attention to them stealing. And all of these issues has a massive knock-on effect that over time adds up and in a game would prevent leveling up. Cops aren't taught how trauma messes with one's memory, so victims of rape being unable to keep timelines and certain facts straight are actually stronger evidence for a rape, but they are instead treated as suspect as false rape accusers, even though if we included all the unreported rapes, only 1.4% of all reported rapes would be false, and only 20% of rape accusations even make it to the stage where the accused even finds out about it. And I'm not even going to get into the ways one has buffs over indigenous people, people with mental and physical disabilities, LGBTQ+, and so on, do not have. Sadly, when a law is passed trying to give buffs like affirmative action to people who unfairly don't have them or just have straight-up curses, since everyone can see those buffs and no one can see their own, you will get people on the right claiming that it's easier to be a minority or a woman than it is to be a white man. This is silly, of course, but none of them can see all the privilege and buffs they already have and all of the curses the other group has, especially if they're poorly taught history. I like my buffs, but in my mind, they should just be a given and how everyone gets to play the game of life. And in my own experience, I actually thought that was how it worked for everyone. Once I looked at the data and listened to others' experiences and stepped out of my own parochialism, I realized just how lucky I am even with my neurodivergent tendencies. Stop thinking of privilege as a level you're at. Privilege is a buff, not a level. Sometimes you face situations where your buff lets you level up faster than others. Sometimes you just suck at life and wasted your buffs. Sometimes people lack these buffs and just worked harder than you. Never apologize for your buffs, but fight your ass off so that everyone can start on the same level playing field so we can actually have a real meritocracy instead of this delusional privileged class of people who really do believe they should be in charge and earn their level ups over the poor or woman or minority who never had these buffs. So thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I'm sure there was nothing controversial about this and everyone will happily get along in the comments section, which you can do on the YouTube version of this video or my Facebook page, After School Democracy. Link in the show notes. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis 2814 on YouTube, and I have over 500 videos on different topics that I've made over the past 10 years. Please subscribe, and if your podcast site has the option, give me a like or review. If you think what I have to say informed you, consider supporting my Patreon. I'll be doing this podcast weekly and try to get it out on the same day, so I hope to see you here next week, ready to be filled with new ideas. Take care. This channel is helped tremendously by the generous supporters on Patreon. A big thank you to the wonderful Joe Taylor, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Ogrel for their support at the $10 a month Wapawet level. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.